Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, once again, and welcome to this week's Free Thought Hour. We have a very interesting guest. I can hardly wait to hear about his life story because what he's done it's totally amazing. You will hear about it just as soon as I've introduced my co-host, Tercia, who's struggling with the situation in South Africa, which involves extreme cold because it's winter down under, as you know, and also load shedding. So we're lucky that she's got some electricity and is actually able to be here. Hello, Tercia.
Hello, John, and hello to our listeners and viewers.
How
It's not so
the
cold.
devil are you?
I'm very well. It's not so cold tonight. I'm actually a little bit overdressed, but we have electricity. And oh yes, and the Springboks won the match against Wales. So we are in a very good mood tonight, all of us.
Well, I won't tell you about the success of our women's football team because I don't want to brag really. That's about it.
Well, nothing else but rugby matters in any case. So.
Yeah. So, would you like me to introduce you to our guest tonight, Jason Jarvis? Here he is.
I cannot.
Right, yeah, good evening.
How the devil are you, Jason?
Well, yeah, I'm pretty good. I've actually I'm recovering from COVID, which I've had for the second time, but I'm feeling tested negative today, and I'm feeling pretty good. So yeah, I'm not bad at all. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason that you're here, Jason, is because we bumped into each other on one of the social media platforms. I don't know I can't remember what it was. It might have been Twitter, might have been Facebook, but I decided that you seemed to be a bit of a kindred spirit because I can't remember the conversation. You were liking the same sort of stuff as me. And I looked at your profile and I discovered that you were a teacher. I'm an ex-teacher. And I discovered that you had a special needs involvement. And I did a bit of that. I was involved in as an EBD school.
Yeah.
Emotionally and behaviorally disturbed school.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether that's a terminology you're allowed to use now. But this was back
certainly not the current one, whether you're allowed. Yeah.
They keep changing because after a few years they turn into an insult.
Yeah.
We used to be able to say spastic, and it wasn't rude. In fact, I knew a girl once upon a time, a long time ago now, who I was teaching her to play the guitar, and she was a polio victim, so she had irons on her feet and often walked with those half crutches. But I was teaching her to play the guitar, and I said, look, use all your fingers. You're not using your little finger. Why aren't you using it? And she said, it's a bit spastic.
I mean, there was the spastic society, wasn't there? So I think in origin, the word spastic was not an insult, but of course it was used by a lot of people as bullying. So it was decided to abandon the term, and now, of course, people wouldn't or certainly shouldn't use it. Yeah.
And that happens to all of our terms after a decade or two, doesn't it? I mean, whatever terminology we use to describe special needs or a particular special need, in a few years' time, it's being used in a bad way, and we have to think of a new one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As a teacher myself, so I don't know if this is going to be a good conversation or a really boring one because
we might have a ball, mightn't we? But everyone looking in might think, "Oh my goodness!" Yeah.
Well, I come from a family of teachers. My father was a school principal, my mom was a teacher, and my brother is currently a teacher. But I must confess that my mom was actually a special needs teacher as well, and talking about terminology, I don't think we're all special, but I think it's a little bit condescending to we are all special and we are not special. that brings us to the whole idea of what is normal, and how did you get into this, Jason? What is it? Did it just happen, or was it something that always fascinated you?
Now's your chance, Jason.
Yeah,
We want
okay. So, well, I suppose
start at the beginning.
yeah, I'll do a sort of David Copperfield. I was born. Well, I probably wouldn't actually, but I mean, I didn't just fall into it. No, I think I suppose I probably should start more or less at the beginning, but I'll start kind of midway through, and then we'll go back to the beginning. I suppose one of the things was I had quite a sort of a difficult start to life myself in some ways. I mean, I'm not saying it's the most difficult. I'm sure some people have had worse. But I was adopted at a fairly young age of about two and a half. And I think later in school, I actually did become quite sort of challenging in my behaviour at school, especially crystallizing really in secondary school. And I managed to get expelled in the first year of secondary school, and I went a bit off the rails actually. And it was all quite odd because I just stopped going to lessons, or mainly stopped going to lessons. The lessons I did go to, I was very disruptive, and I think I ended up being quite unhappy actually. And then I went to a different school, which I nearly got it. Well, I kind of was expelled from there, but on I had a last minute reprieve. So I suppose that maybe because in my teenage years, I sort of thought a lot about, what was going on and why I was so desperately unhappy. And at times I really was unhappy, and I was questioning the point of existence and, what is life, and, all a bit Buddha-like really. What is life? Why do we suffer? Why do we live at all, etc. And, at times I don't think I wasn't ever actively suicidal. I never tried to actually kill myself, but I was certainly thinking about what is the point of life. And I certainly had thoughts about, is there any point carrying on and ending it, even though, thank goodness I didn't actually do anything like that. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, I kind of went off the rails. I kind of just about managed to get back into school. Actually had a couple of years of being really good at school, but then in what we now call year 11, my family moved, or my dad moved, and we were all due to move to South Wales, but I started going off the rails again a bit then. So I left school early and ended up doing my O-levels, because I'm old enough to have done O-levels in South Wales as an external candidate. Then went to, sixth form, had a few arguments there because I wasn't allowed to grow a beard, left sixth form, but ended up doing A-levels. And I managed to get into Oxford University, actually. Possibly in my teeth, I'm not sure. But yeah.
That's an achievement, isn't it? So how did you manage to bluff your way on with the interview or whatever it was?
Well, maybe bluff was. No, I don't know. I mean, I think one thing that was strange, well, I say strange, I'm sure it applies to a lot of people actually, that I hated many aspects of school, but I did quite like learning. So I was a voracious reader. Still am when I get the chance, which isn't all the time. And so I was really into reading. I was really into learning, but I didn't do a lot of the schoolwork. So I probably was pretty bright and intelligent. So it's not entirely a bluff, but on the other hand, yeah, I did underachieve in my O-levels, a little bit in my A-levels. I was probably lucky in the sense that back in those days they had an entrance exam to Oxford, so I passed that. Anyway, and then after university, I did some travelling and I went into sort of psychiatric nursing as an unqualified nurse. And I did have possibly a plan to carry on in that, or maybe, I don't know, do social work or something. But I became a bit disillusioned with the whole mental health system in Britain then. And I decided, oh, I know what, I'll be a teacher because I love reading. I love trying to help people. And yeah, it'd be great being a teacher, which I think for the first 2 or 3 years of being a teacher, I kept saying to myself, oh my goodness, why on earth did I choose to do this? But eventually I kind of got used to it. And then one of the schools I was at, one of the deputy heads, I think, sort of thought I've got a really good manner with young people who are kind of bit off the rails, going off the tracks. And so she encouraged me to apply for a job, which I did as a sort of what was called head of alternative curriculum. And then from that, I went on to become a head teacher of a small SCMH school, as they now call them. But it is like EBD as used to be. So EBD used to stand for educational behavioural difficulties. Or was it emotional behavioural difficulties, perhaps?
Emotional.
Yeah. And so SCMH is social and emotional mental health needs. So, you know, anyway.
Jason,
so it wasn't entirely coincidence. Yeah.
Jason, can you tell me what is your daily professional life involve? So sort of give me a 3-second, let's make it 30-second.
Yeah.
So do you still work intimately with children, or are you more in a managerial role? How hands-on are you still involved, and what age children are you involved with?
So currently I'm actually doing sort of supply work. So, but quite a lot of it is with children who are excluded from mainstream school. So it is a lot of teaching. When I was a head teacher, it was still, even though there was a managerial aspect to the role, because it was a very small school, there was still a lot of contact with the young people every day. So, I mean, I've probably gone way over 30 seconds, but just to give an idea, I'd get in early, kind of try and arrange the day. There'd be lots of good social interactions. Sometimes there'd be some crises. Sometimes there'd be a behaviour explosion. Sometimes there'd be a safeguarding thing. So I remember having very full, hectic days, but very satisfying in many ways because, I think in many cases we really did help young people turn their lives around, and some of them even said that themselves. So it was a very satisfying and enjoyable work, even though it was sometimes pretty stressful.
Can I interpose here a bit? Because first of all, a lot of us think that teaching is easy because we've all been pupils and we've watched the teachers and we see what they do, and they make it look easy. And of course, we know that they only work from 9 until 3, and then they have yes, I know. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah, and then they have 14 weeks off every year, something like that. So it's an attractive proposition, but the truth is very, very different. It's a really tough profession to be in. You've got to face a lot of different sorts of conflict and trying to please too many masters. You've got to please the pupils. The first thing you learn is not to alienate your class.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to please their parents. You've got to try and do the expectations of their parents. Then you've got to please the staff, the other members of staff, and the higher ones up the tier. And then you've got to please the governors. And it's a bit of a lose-lose situation to be in.
I want to get back to something Jason said, because to me that is very, very telling. And I don't want to take over the conversation, but it might be useful. I started out studying journalism. Then I visited my father's school in my second year with him when he was appointed to uni school. And I never wanted to be a teacher because I didn't want to follow in my parents' footsteps. But then I had this visit to a primary school, and I came back and I said to my dad, I think I want to change my course. I want to be a teacher because I love that interaction. And I saw him interacting with the kids. Then I taught for about 9 years in a primary school. So that's ages 11 to 13, roundabout. And then I moved out of that sort of education system. I did a little bit of work for my husband in a business. And then when COVID struck, I had a little cottage tutoring group at my house, privately. The largest number of students I had was 9 at one stage, of which one was my own son. Not that that's really relevant, but what I found in having that experience is that you struck a chord with me when you said that you hated school, but you loved learning. And having come from a school system, an educational system, and whether it's the United States or South African or the British, there's some sort of system involved, and then moved into sort of tertiary, and then had this, for the first time in my adult life, professional life, having the opportunity to teach kids in a sort of free-flowing form, where I had 9 kids. And I saw firsthand the difference between loving school and hating learning, or the one that I prefer, hating school and loving learning. And it's a very interesting dynamic. Would you like to say something about that whole thing of hating school but loving learning, and that school and learning are actually 2 quite different concepts in the modern idiom?
I mean, certainly, I think in my case, and I think it does apply to quite a number of young people I've taught and been head teacher with and so on. In my case, I think because sort of early disrupted attachments, as in I lived with my biological mum, if you like, for 2.5 years, but then I never saw her again because I was adopted, and I was adopted into a really loving and wonderful family, and it was great. But I think because of that initial sort of loss, at least that's how I've come to understand it since, there were many insecurities in me. So I was always rebelling against, I mean, who knows why we are what we're like to some extent, but I think that was part of it, that I was rebelling, pushing against boundaries, always breaking the rules. And sometimes it was about kind of wanting to be accepted, but even if I was accepted, sort of pushing against it, because I didn't believe myself that I was loved. I mean, I did later, but I remember even when I was about 5 having this very disturbing dream that I was asleep. In my dream, I was asleep. And then I woke up. I didn't really wake up. I was dreaming. But I went into the lounge and my dad said, "Oh, we don't really love you," and got down a rifle and proceeded to shoot me. And I think I had this sort of deep insecurity that made me push against school. And but then I just had this love of learning, and I can't really explain it except, I don't know. I mean, I saw the US TV series The Wire, and I'm sure there's a line in that. I've tried to find it since, but I can't find it exactly. But it's something like, "Children will learn. The only question is what and where." So every person's born with a mind, with a brain that's hungry for experience, hungry for knowledge, asking questions. And yet, if those questions aren't satisfied in school, or someone, you said some people hate learning. I'm not sure anyone necessarily hates learning, but some people learn at a young age that they're crap at it, that they're rubbish, and they have this self-belief that they can't learn. It's a wrong self-belief. But so what I was trying to say is, I've kind of forgotten the question now, but you asked me to expand on that dichotomy of hating school and loving learning. I think in my case, there's a very, very much a need for emotional acceptance and to sort of soothe my emotional deep insecurities before I could even begin to learn in a formal context. And that's certainly the experience I've had with a lot of young people I've taught, who have mainly been excluded from the mainstream setting. It's not because they're bad, it's because there's things in their life that are so difficult that they cannot and will not conform to the day-to-day structures, because things are so difficult for them. That's what I found it.
I'd like to put a contribution here, because humans and a lot of other animals are definitely inquisitive, and that's because knowledge is it's valuable. It's a way to succeed. I mean, if you meet, I'm also in another group where we talk about things like this. And one of the topics we did recently was, is ignorance bliss? And I pointed out that if you're in a jungle and you see a snake, it's actually very helpful to know whether that's a poisonous snake that can kill you, or whether it's a snake that's delicious and you can skin it and barbecue it for your lunch. So knowledge is a valuable product, and we've evolved to be adapted to seek it, which is very understandable. But the trouble is, we want to find it for ourselves. We don't want to hold it. We don't want to have it imposed on us.
Yeah.
And I remember when I started teaching long time ago, the regime was the cane. I mean, I think it was the second school that I went to as a new teacher. I think what had happened was the deputy head had had a breakdown, and he'd been early retired, and I was not appointed to be in his role, but I was a new teacher to fill some of the timetable gaps. And I went into the staff room, and one of the old lags in the staff room there said, "Do you want to borrow my cane? Here's what to do to establish your authority. You go into the classroom, you find a boy whose tie isn't straight, you cane him, and then you'll never have any trouble."
Gosh, yeah.
Now, I didn't take that advice, and I did have trouble, of course, because that was what they were used to. And this was so long ago that many members of staff were ex-military. They'd finished their military service. It was after the war. They'd done their what's it called, conscription. And they were looking for some way of earning the rest of their lives, and many of them went into teaching. And they didn't teach. What they did was instructed. And that doesn't go down well.
I want to ask you, Jason, as the only female in the conversation at the moment, and as what John said just now about caning, I grew up in the era when caning was also still the norm. In fact, just after I began teaching, it was stopped. Now, I never believed in violence as a solution to solving any problems. I don't know if it's because I'm a woman. Maybe we do have a different approach, but what I find in South Africa, at least, is that there are very few good men in education. What is the situation in the UK, and what do you think about the role of men or the male figure? I don't want to, because children do perceive gender roles as well. And what is your opinion about this whole thing of the male role model in teaching? Because there is this perception that male educators are not that common, and that they are often perceived, John, especially you coming from the old school, they are the ones that enforce the discipline, what is your opinion on that, and how does that play into working with special needs children, Jason?
I mean, I think in Britain, at least, it's sort of in primary school, certainly the kind of received wisdom, I don't know if it's entirely true, but I think there's an element of truth to it, that men are less common than women. In special education, not necessarily. I mean, maybe a little bit, but I don't think there's such a sort of difference. I don't think there's a shortage of male education staff so much. Trying to think, really. I certainly think that, I'm very much opposed to the kind of disciplinarian stance completely. I think there's probably, it's a bit of a cliche, but there's probably something to be said for positive male role models, which in this case, I'd say part of being positive is that they're not particular. They might be physical in terms of sport or something like that, but they're not at all violent. They are empathic. They are emotional. I don't know. It's not something I've thought about enough, probably, to be fair. But I certainly think you need a mix for sure. And I think there are some. There are quite a. When I worked at the school, the SCMH school, we did have at times more boys than girls, but sometimes it's more pronounced than others. I mean, I think at the worst it was about a third girls and 2/3 boys, but other times it became nearly equal. But I mean, probably did have slightly more women's staff, but it wasn't that polarized. It wasn't that pronounced, really.
Yeah, well, I've got a contribution to make here too. First of all, I want to say that the rule by fear regime only lasted for a couple of years at the very beginning of my teaching career. And we soon moved over to reward instead of, criticism.
Yeah.
Probably too far. The pendulum doesn't stop in a sensible place, does it? And the outcome of that was, this was a terrible period when we had a new headmaster come along, and he stood up in assembly in the early days of his appointment, and he said, "There's not going to be any caning at this school." Now, of course, that was an open invitation, because he didn't say instead we're going to have these punishments, and the pupils naturally took it as an invitation to try and get away with whatever they could, and that school was bedlam for a year or more, until it sort of worked through the system. I remember the deputy head, who'd had a lot of caning in his past, suddenly had to give up the cane, and it was pathetic to watch him, because I did some team teaching with him, and he used to say, "I'm a really hard teacher. You just ask your brothers," because they'd been caned, and he was hoping to survive on the record of the past. But I also wanted to go on and say a bit about the special educational needs system, because about the balance of the sexes in teaching, because when I started, I was a secondary teacher, and it was broadly 2/3 men, 1/3 women.
Yeah.
Well,
really, yeah.
Then what happened was the teachers' unions campaigned for equality of pay, because at that stage men were given a little bit more money for doing the same job. That was acceptable back then. But the teaching unions very sensibly campaigned for equality of pay, and the government gave it. But what they made political capital out of it by, instead of raising the underpaid women up to the level of the men, because of course you would, if you're a state employer, you want to save money so that you can spend it on other areas of the budget, then you will level down, won't you? And the outcome of that was men left the profession for better paid jobs, and the profession became predominantly female from then on, and it's only just sort of getting back to being a bit more equal.
I was going to say, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, finish your thought.
I was just going to say, actually, it's interesting to hear you say about the head suddenly announcing no more caning, but which I think is great. I mean, I very, very much oppose corporal punishment, but I do think it was very much a missed opportunity to not then bring in a whole other way of managing behaviour. which it sounds like there was just no thought put into that. But
Yeah.
one of the I really
main,
wanted to go on.
My main complaint was he needn't have said that. You know, it was an invitation.
Don't do it.
He could have kept that a little bit more quiet, and they would have found out eventually. But stating it is like saying, "Okay, anything goes," and it starts now.
I was going to say a few years ago, quite a few years ago, probably about 15 years ago, I discovered a American author called Daniel Hughes, who's written a lot on attachment, and he's kind of become, in a way, almost my guru in terms of not teaching in general, but certainly teaching with traumatized and damaged teenagers, a bit like I myself was. Perhaps still am when I'm not a teenager anymore. But he writes about attachment-focused parenting, but I've transferred that very much into attachment-focused teaching, where, and he has different, there's an acronym PLACE, I think, about playfulness, love, acceptance, curiosity, empathy. And it's too much to go into in this show, but it's definitely worth checking out some of his ideas. So Daniel Hughes, and it's all about it's based on attachment theory as well, which is a whole sort of area of psychology, but it's based on the idea that an infant has his or her needs met as an infant, hopefully that's the idea, and then begins to form a self-concept that I'm someone worthy of love, being loved, and adults as people worthy of trust. But of course, in many cases, for different reasons, and it may not be the fault of the parents themselves, but they may have addiction problems, or there could be all sorts of reasons. But a child is actually needs are neglected, or an infant's needs are neglected, and she begins to form a sort of self-image as I'm someone unworthy of love, and adults are someone to be feared and not trusted. And I think that can have big effects on people's behavior throughout life, to be honest. So and the Daniel body of work, and it's not the only one, there's lots of other therapists who've worked on attachment as well, but I think it provides really useful models for how to approach, I suppose, initially teenagers who suffered trauma, but actually I think those approaches work with everyone to a greater or lesser extent. And one of the initiatives I've been involved in is sort of trauma-informed schools. So it's not just for special education, because I'm probably going to say your name wrong now. Is it Therese? No, it's not Therese.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't mind. It's an Afrikaans name.
We're all special. We're all unique. So actually, special education is a little bit of a kind of stigmatizing thing. So actually, I think a kind of trauma-informed response, an attachment-focused response, is something that should work for all pupils in all schools, and indeed all people in society. So I'd go way beyond just education and say we need to start sort of accepting one another a lot more, loving one another a lot more, being curious and empathic rather than sort of condemning others, but trying to enter into their world and trying to find out what their point of view is, really.
Absolutely.
John and Jason, I want to plug a book with you guys that I was just became aware of last week. It's a book by Timothy Kieran O'Mahony. You might have heard of him. It's the brain-based classroom. And
but I don't know it.
But I've been listening to podcasts with him, and everything that you've said resonates with this idea that the old system is basically based on Skinner and all the psychological or pedagogical methods, whereas we now know so much more about the brain, and that you cannot learn if your brain is not ready to learn, and you have to speak to the primitive parts of the brain, those the emotional parts. You have to calm the fight or flight response before you can begin to teach, and that's all about establishing a nurturing, comforting, attachment type relationship, and the element of playfulness and yeah. So maybe that's something our listeners can also look at if you have children or if you're a teacher. But Jason, I wanted to ask you two things. You, without divulging any personal information or getting too personal about students of yours, what was your most inspiring teaching moment, or is there any really good story that you can tell us about where you had maybe a struggle with a learner and then, or something that happened that really struck a chord with you, that inspired you, and when things get tough in the classroom, or that makes you keep going? Can you tell us something about that, perhaps?
Yeah, maybe. Feel like I'm in a job interview now. But yeah, what was I going to say? I mean, rather than sort of talk about my most inspired teaching moment, which I could probably make one up, but you know, I'm just thinking really. I think one of the things, I mean, so some of my real motivators for being a head teacher of the school I was at, which sadly closed actually, and there's a whole other story behind that, but it wasn't because of any issues in the school. It's because it was run by a charity, and the charity entered into some financial issues. Anyway, we'll leave that to one side. I think a lot of the issues really were to do with reaching out to pupils who in many cases weren't attending, and so, you know, I can think of a couple of examples, and I won't say anything to identify them, but there was one girl who hardly ever attended. Her mum, when she did answer, was sort of quite evasive or didn't know where she was, and you know, and we reported this particular pupil was on role at another school, but coming to us or not coming to us, and we reported everything dutifully on, but it was like no one was really taking responsibility. So we kind of got a bit of a task force together, and we made some interventions, and we found out, we located where she was, and we sort of coaxed her, as in we asked her to come in. We had a bit of a meeting, and then anyway, to cut a long story short, it was a good experience, because although she was very, very difficult to manage, and there were times when she was nearly unteachable, really, nevertheless, she stabilized, and things went reasonably well. And she went from a position where, I mean, I think at one point I did write to the Director of Children's Services saying, we have no idea where this young person is. And for all we know, she could be dead, which, you know, thank goodness she wasn't, but wasn't necessarily an exaggeration, because we really didn't know where she was. And, you know, she ended up going to college, and the last I heard, and this is quite a long time ago, you know, she completed college. So it was a success story, really. And I mean, there was another lad, a similar sort of story, really, and his dad was a heroin addict, and he often didn't know where he was. And there's all sorts of, so they're not the normal sort of teaching moments, like I don't know, introduced angles to year 8 and it really clicked with them. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That's great. But it's kind of almost going deeper into why someone's not at school, what the reasons behind it are, but not just that, but also the systems in place where a school might follow a certain procedure. They phone, they report them missing to the police, but then that's job done. Whereas in the school I worked at, I was thinking, well, it's not job done. For all we know, they could be one of the young people who falls through the cracks, and then it ends up in a kind of horrendous, serious case review. Let's not let that happen. Let's do our very best to stop it before it does happen. So they're my kind of proudest moments, really, that we did above and beyond, and I think in some cases save people's lives. I think, not to be too melodramatic, but also, you know, also hopefully give them that sense that they are loved and that they are worthy of love. So that was kind of my motivation.
That goes back to what I was saying about the sort of public perception of what a teacher does, because it's very different from what the pupil sees a teacher do. These days, it's much more in a parental sort of role, And we've got to remember that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so you've somehow got to get the pupil's permission to be taught by you before you can start.
Yeah.
And that means that nowadays, since we've thrown away the cane and all the physical punishment, nowadays the teacher's role merges with the social worker's role.
I want to ask. I'm not familiar. I'm fairly familiar with one of the curricula that is followed in the UK, but I'm not too familiar with the school system. But I'm of the opinion that the school systems that we have worldwide, except maybe in the Scandinavian countries, because I know they have very different systems. But I'm of the opinion that the systems that we have currently in most first world countries and developing countries like South Africa are actually not conducive to learning, because they are still focused on imparting knowledge that these days is available in our back pockets. And the system that we've created, the institution, is approximately 60 to 70 years out of date. What would you, and that speaks to, as far as I'm concerned, to special needs as well as so-called normal children.
Mainstream,
mainstream. So what would you say to that, Jason? And what is your, I know, sorry, I just have to interrupt myself here, because in South Africa there's also this movement towards integration, where you don't want special schools or special needs schools, and there's a lot of merit in that, but then you need to have a more flexible system as well. So how would you speak to that, Jason?
Well, yeah, so the big questions. I mean, what John was saying about, I think it's true that in many cases, a teacher's job isn't just to impart knowledge. In fact, I don't think it is to impart knowledge at all. I think it should be about helping that young person create their own knowledge. But it's also can be like being like a social worker, like being a parent. I think some teachers, perhaps understandably, though, find that to be a stress and a strain, because our education system isn't really built around that. And I actually wish it was. And I wish the schools were seen much more as part of the community, and that the teachers were seen much more as, in a sense, kind of carers, as social workers, as people working alongside young people to set up learning for them. And I also do think the whole kind of fragmentation of the curriculum is something that should be challenged. And it's interesting, really, because I think I probably was a bit precocious as a teenager, but when I was around 11, I read a book. I've actually brought it with me now. It's the very copy that I bought when I was 11, called we probably can't really see it, but you can just about see the cover, Wholeness and the Implicate Order by David Bohm, who's a kind of theoretical physicist, actually. But it was a really fascinating book that kind of was partly about quantum physics, but also delved into philosophy and almost a kind of mysticism, actually. And it was really interesting about fragmentation. And his big idea was that actually we are, and probably I'm going to sound a bit mystical here, but we are part of an implicate order. We see ourselves as, I'm Jason Travis, actually my Facebook name's a slight pseudonym, but I'm Jason. I do this, I do that, and we're separate individuals. I teach maths, I teach English, I do this, etc. Now, of course, in a way, I mean, all those things are true, but we're also part of a kind of flowing reality. Now, so I'm not suggesting at school we say, let's study a flowing reality, but I am suggesting that we almost tear up the curriculum, and instead of having a separate compartmentalized lessons, that you actually have projects where you bring in, obviously, maths, you bring in English, you bring in literacy, you bring in geography, you bring in, but actually students are encouraged to take part in projects where all of those skills are part of an implicate wholeness, really. So that's what I think. I mean, obviously it's a big topic.
Oh, you're right up my alley. You're getting me so excited, because what I would like to see is that we teach children that the fact that we have subjects that are in different boxes is just so that we can actually handle the information. That's not the way that people work. It's that the fact that we have subjects has the same function of shelves in a cupboard. It's just a way for us to organize many different things, but you can organize it in different manners, and it's still one cupboard, and it's all connected. And there's not enough emphasis on the way that message is brought across in the whole structure of the curriculum. Now we're doing science, now we're doing physics, now we're doing maths, now we're doing history. Whereas we have to make the kids understand that the fact that we have subjects is to make things simpler for us. That's not a reflection of what things are like,
a human fabrication.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned a couple more things that I'd like to pick up on. I think one of you, I can't remember which, said that schools always seem to be out of date. And I remember way back in the 1960s when we had they were fee-paying schools, but they were the opposite of the traditional British public school. They were let it all hang out schools,
etc.
Sorry,
Summerhill and so on. Is it called Summerhill? Yeah, I think it's
right. Yeah. And there was no anything, no system, no control. It was a one long party, and I was thinking, what sort of a parent wants their child to go to a school like that? and so to an extent, we want our children to go to schools that are a bit yesterday. We don't really want them to be at the cutting edge of the craziness of now, do we?
Well, if you talk, sorry, I'm going to jump in here, Jason.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
I'm not saying disregard structure, because when you have a bunch of people, I would say if you're working with kids, if you have anything more than 10, you need structure and lessons and bells that ring is definitely part of the structure. But that is just because you have a number of people that you have to sort of manage. And I don't think we should confuse the structure to keep things sort of safe and organized. We shouldn't impart that too much onto the learning process and the curriculum. And I think that becomes a problem. And oops, I'm so sorry. My structure almost left me there. My tablet is very precariously balanced on my dad's tripod. So I get what you say there, John, but it's difficult. Teaching is very complicated. I think that's the bottom line. It's a difficult, complicated job, and working with special.
At those experimental schools, they had no bells, and I wanted bells.
You want a bell?
You're right, but that I think teaching has got to. It's not imposing; it's leading, isn't it? I mean, even the word, the origin of education is educo, which means I lead, and so the thing is here. What we need are very small classes, because when I was teaching in a special educational needs school, I had a class of 8. And yet when I was in a mainstream school, I had 30. In one case, I had 41 in my class that I was supposed to teach chemistry to. It was an impossible task. And and so class size is key to this. And the other thing is, because you really want a social arrangement. It needs to be directed like a chairman role, but it also needs to be in a friendly basis rather than instruction, as I was saying earlier on. And the other problem is that currently schools just don't know how to relate to IT. Some of them ban phones, I don't know what your experience is, but others, and I favor this direction, accept phones because they're a gateway. They're a gateway to so much other stuff, as long as you can keep it relevant and bring it to the lesson. That's the difficult thing. Stopping them going off piste, as it were, into their own reverie. So I want to have phones because, I've got children in my car when I'm driving, and I say, I wonder about this, Google it, but that's the sort of relationship I've got in the family setting. I want to have that in the school, in the classroom setting.
So Jason, I wanted to ask you, do you have children of your own?
I do, yes. I have three children, a 14-year-old, 10-year-old, 6-year-old. Yeah.
The asking that, I want to tell you why I'm asking that, and I'd like to hear your opinion on that. And John, obviously yours too. But I had my first child after teaching for 5 years, and I still say I don't think one can really teach if one hasn't raised one's own child. I know that's unfair. Many people, that's a terrible thing to say. But I as a person, I needed to have the experience of having my own child, because for me it completely changed the way that I saw children.
Yes.
So the teacher that I was before I had my own kids and the teacher that I was afterwards, I think it would have been two completely different types of teachers. Yes, and I think that the post-parenthood one would be the better one. So Jason, what do you say to that?
There's controversy for you.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you will use very similar skills as a parent and as a teacher. So I wouldn't necessarily want to say that. I'm sure there are plenty of good teachers who haven't been parents themselves but have learned those parenting skills through teaching or through observing others, however. But I do think there's a lot of commonality between the roles. I mean, I think going back to the question, I'm probably much more in favour of experimental schools than either of you two, but we won't go into that massively. But I think it's called Summerhill. I think it's quite interesting. I mean, there may have been times where some things were over the top, but I don't know. I think if young people are given an element of choice, they may well choose a very structured approach to the curriculum. I think it's probably a misconception to think it's between structure and freedom, actually. I think you can have very structured approaches that admit that this is a particular approach, but don't say this is the only way to approach it. Anyway, what I was to bring it back to your sort of question around parenting, I think what we really need is schools that are communities of learning and that care for one another. And I do think John's absolutely right that class size is critical and crucial. I mean, maybe we can't all have classes of 8, but certainly classes that are smaller where the needs of the whole child are very much looked after. Because I think education is on an outdated model, but actually in the 70s in Britain it's kind of been trashed, hasn't it, by various successive governments. But I think that kind of moved towards a more humanistic, holistic approach to education and project-based learning. I think that was very much the right way to go. And certainly I agree that mobile phones are difficult, aren't they? Because they can raise all sorts of safeguarding and bullying things. But ultimately, I think banning technology from the classroom is not the way to go. And we need to integrate technology into learning, and it can very much contribute towards a project-based learning. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I see that Tercia's got some of her fans in the audience. This is rather nice.
Very nice, thank you.
One of the subjects we've not even hinted upon was, but it was in my kind of introduction, that I did some research in the early, I don't think it said when it was, but the early 90s, into use of psychedelics. And I'm not suggesting we use psychedelics in education, but one of the points earlier was quite interesting about how we compartmentalize things and we chunk things. And there's been, I mean, we've not got time to discuss it now, I know, but there's been lots of interesting research by, I think it's Robin Carhart Harris, about how various psychedelic substances such as LSD and psilocybin from magic mushrooms kind of dampen down the default mode network of the brain, and how a brain on LSD is very similar to a young child's brain. So, and I think, I'm certainly not suggesting we use psychedelics in education, but what I do think we can do is very much use the sense of amazement that a young child has and rediscover the wonder of wonder of first learning, and kind of light up the areas of the brain that are lit up in young children's, in infants' brains. But again, we're kind of running out of time, and there's probably an hour or two to discuss on that, but not today.
I just want to say, I think it might be a good idea to put teachers on LSD, all of us. No, I'm just joking, but in a serious vein, maybe reminding teachers what it feels like to be a child is not such a bad idea. And I think the secret to being a good teacher is to remember what it's like not to know things. And to me, as an educator, that is the hardest thing, to imagine, to unlearn what you know, because that's the only way to. And maybe that's where something like psilocybin for educators, maybe teachers should go on a weekend away and all have a psilocybin trip to just feel what that infant brain is like. And it will help with dealing with teenagers.
There might be some interesting CPD.
I want to mention, apropos class size, I want to mention that currently we assess children on the basis of their aptitude for a particular topic area or subject area, for their ability, whether they have a natural bent to achieve in that particular subject area, and for their effort, for whether they're trying hard to achieve and whether they have the wish to succeed, if you like. But one thing we don't seem to assess them for is their attitude. And I think apropos class size, if we considered attitude, willingness to be taught, we could have bigger classes of those and smaller classes of the unwilling.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
I remember, John, when I was still teaching, that I would actually assess when I did things. I'm a language teacher. I don't know what your subject area is, Jason, whether you have a subject area. Do you?
Well, yeah, it's English was my first subject, and then maths as a second one, so kind of straddling.
Okay, well, those were actually my two specialization subjects as well. Yeah. So we've got something in common there. But I remember when it comes to oral and reading, some children really, really found it incredibly difficult to stand up and talk in front of an audience. And I would assess them on their willingness to just get over their fear and stand in front of the class. I remember having rubrics that actually accounted for that. which was
Yeah.
not, it was good that I was able to do that, that I was able to have that autonomy and flexibility. But John, we 8 seconds past our hour, and I know
I
you are
know,
very
yes. Yeah.
hour, so I will
Yes.
keep my mouth shut now.
Well, I do like to be fairly strict about ringing the bell. and I'm going to do that now. It's been a great chat. I've thoroughly enjoyed. Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
Jason.
it's been great. Yeah.
And
Carry on for
I want to promote next week's show because we have an interesting guest in the name of John Hamill, who is an ex-secretary of Atheist Alliance International. He left in about February, I think, 2016. No, one of those years, 2016, 17. And since then, he's made it his business to rubbish Atheist Alliance International. I'm going to chat with him and see why does he spend his life? What's he got to win out of this? But anyway, that's next week's show. It could get quite sparky. Let's see what happens next week at the same time, the same place, with guest John Hamill. And there you are. Thank you, James. Kieran O'Mahony.
And I could perhaps, and John, maybe we can try to get Steve J. Perlman as a guest, but on his podcast, Headteacher, there's a 2-part interview with Kieran O'Mahony, and anybody who's in education could do really well to listen to that podcast. And it's the brain, but it's exactly all the things that we talked about here. And I just want to say in closing on the topic of teaching, that is my passion. I do hope that anybody who's a parent and a teacher realizes that we hold more power than any government, because one teacher can change the life of a person. And it is incredible power, because you don't know what you can unleash onto the world, or prevent from being given to the world. So teachers out there, you are really, really important. Remember that.
Yes,
do a good job, work hard.
Yeah, that's very topical at the moment, because Sir Mo Farah, the marathon runner, the world-breaking marathon runner, has just released his life story in which he revealed that he was trafficked to the UK at the age of 9, and it was he came without language, he couldn't speak English, and he was forced to work as a domestic servant by the woman who brought him here on a false passport. Watch his show. It's really good. It's a BBC show. Yeah. So thank you very much, both of you. I've enjoyed this, and I regret that I'm going to have to call an end to it because of the description of the show. Here, Jason. Yes, thank you for taking part, members of the audience and future members of the audience too. Say bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.